What if you could have invested in Tom Brady's stock as a rookie? Your investment would have been up over 4,000%. Now it's not what if, but who's next? Mojo is the all-new sports stock market that lets you invest in your favorite athletes and cash in on your passion. Sign up right now in the Apple App Store to get your first stock free worth up to $10,000. Over 300 NFL players are listed on Mojo, so you can invest in rookies like Breece Hall, rising stars like Elijah Moore, comeback candidates like Saquon Barkley, and superstars like Patrick Mahomes. Go long to make money when an underrated diamond in the rough breaks out, or short an overrated rival and make money as he flops. Prices move with every play, every game, and every headline, and you can buy and sell instantly anytime, all year long, so the action never stops. Mojo is live in New Jersey now. Get Mojo in the App Store today and start turning playmakers into moneymakers. Must be 21 or older to use Mojo and located in New Jersey to make trades. Have a gambling problem? Help is available at 1-800-GAMBLER. Visit mojo.com for more info.
Hey everyone, welcome to The Final Four is Not on the Schedule. I'm your host Eric, alongside with expert analyst Rod. Thanks for joining us on the best MSU basketball podcast featuring in-depth recruiting, game matchup, and post-game analysis. We dive deep to give you the best tools to enjoy the Spartans and impress your friends and family. Hey everybody, it's Eric again, alongside Rod, and we're going to be talking about our number 6 team, the Purdue Boilermakers. Last season overall, they were 29-8 with 14-6 in the Big Ten. They lost in the Sweet 16 by 3 to everybody's darling, St. Peter's. They were number 14th in KenPom rankings. They were number 2 in offense, and they were number 93 on defense. Number 5th in three-point shooting, number 13th in two-point shooting, number 13 in offensive rebound percentage, number 15 in free throw attempts per game. And although they were only 191st in free throw percentage, they were 116th in turnover percentage. But on defense is really where the story is for the Purdue Boilermakers last year. On defense, they were number 134 against the twos, gave up a lot of three attempts, and were only number 42 in percentage of opponent points scored from threes. So they've made it to the Big Ten tournament finals. They lost pretty handily to Iowa, especially Iowa pulled away in the second half. And they had one of the deepest runs probably for Big Ten teams in the NCAA tournament, but it still wasn't that deep. And they were everyone's consensus pick to win the Big Ten pretty easily. And that first game, maybe it was the second game where they played Rutgers, and Rutgers beat them in Piscataway on that Ron Harper half-court shot. You suddenly saw a Purdue team that, they're vulnerable. And I think everyone's perception immediately changed of what this Purdue team was, and that the Big Ten was more wide open than people originally thought.
Yeah, and that is how it played out, of course. They didn't win the Big Ten in the regular season. They didn't win the tournament, and they didn't get to a Final Four. So 0 for 3. And I will admit to being someone who was loudly proclaiming that Purdue was easily the best team in the Big Ten coming into last season. Just to refresh people's memory, there was a lot of national media heat on Michigan as the Big Ten favorites, which I thought made zero sense. And I think the way the season turned out demonstrated that. They were not nearly at the level they were the year before. They had lost too much and hadn't adequately replaced it, particularly at the point guard. Really hurt them, but they were much worse defensively, on and on and on. But Purdue, to me, was the obvious pick because they had everybody back. I thought they would be a gangbuster team offensively, and that part I got right. The number 2 offense in the country. I believe only Gonzaga was better. And that's pretty remarkable to do when you're, what did you say they were in turnover percentage? 119?
They were 116th.
Yeah, that's not great. And especially by Big Ten standards, that's not great. You know, the Big Ten is littered with teams in the top 20 in turnover percentage. For you to be that poor in turnover percentage and still end up with the number 2 offense, what that tells you is you shot the ball phenomenally well. And they did. They shot it from 3 fantastically. They shot it from 2 fantastically. They had elements that no other Matt Painter team through his whole tenure have had, largely because of Jaden Ivey. They actually had a transition game where typically they don't. So they could score that way with him just running the ball down people's throats. They could certainly score in the half court, and they were a great offensive rebounding team too, so they could get second chances when they did miss. All those elements. What I did not see coming was the fact that they would essentially be a Fran McCaffrey team. Great offensively and horrible defensively. Nobody saw that coming. The year prior, with again, essentially the same cast, they were, I think, 34th defensively nationally. So not elite, but anytime you're in the top 40, you're pretty good. And that's in keeping with what they've been throughout most of Matt Painter's tenure. Purdue teams under Matt Painter generally are pretty good defensive squads, you know? So it was not reasonable to see them falling as hard and as fast as they did. But the warning signs were there early, and it just never changed. They could not guard anybody. Some of it, I think, was a guy like Jaden Ivey, who I like his future a great deal, and there's no reason why he shouldn't be a good defensive player when you look at his physical tools. But the fact is he wasn't very good last year. And he played a much bigger role than he had the year prior. So maybe that was part of it, but that's not enough to explain it on its own. They just, across the board, they were just bad. And I think ultimately, if you're looking for one thing to point to that prevented them from accomplishing any of what I assume their preseason goals were, to win a Big Ten championship, win a tournament championship, and go, get to the Final Four, go deep in the tournament, that's a big part of the reason why they didn't accomplish any of those objectives, is that they just couldn't guard people. And so it's a mystery to me why it happened. I've still not really seen it adequately explained, but it was the truth. It's there in black and white in the numbers. So they weren't very good guarding inside the arc, and then they gave up a ton of 3-point attempts. They gave up a relatively high percentage of makes on them, but to be 42nd from the bottom in percentage of points you're giving up to opponents from three, that's not just luck. At that point, you're giving up a lot of clean looks too, in my view. That's what that number is telling you. So they couldn't do it. The only thing they did reasonably well is they didn't foul people very much. But other than that, defensively, man, it was not good.
Is that a reflection? I mean, I know you said you couldn't quite puzzle it out.
If you look at their roster from the year prior, pretty much everybody is back. The only thing that was different is that you had a marginal, and I'm drawing a blank on the kid's name, Wheeler, the power forward, who had a really good freshman season and then never quite made it. He transferred out, but he was replaced by First, who's a better player.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And by the way, was not really that was not the source of their defensive problems. It's hard to understand. Again, the one thing I can point to is Jaden Ivey took some time to come on as a freshman. He had some injury troubles early, and then it took some time for him to find himself. Whereas last season, he was playing heavy minutes from the get-go. But that's not even with his shortcomings, that's not enough to explain it. I just think team-wide, there was just a lack of attention to detail. I think maybe as a group, they fell in love with themselves offensively too much and never, look, I can look at this because it's an interesting question. I can look at this from a Michigan State perspective, and something that, would drive fans batty is even in years where MSU brought everybody or nearly everybody back from a team that was very good the year prior, it would take weeks at a time to find themselves in the next season, to be locked in defensively, to not have turnover problems that were massive, maybe only, serious rather than massive. But you get my point that you would think, and I think the expectation a lot of fans have is, well, if it's all the same guys and they're playing for the same coach, it just ought to be, hey, beat goes on. You pick up right where you left off at the end of last season. It doesn't work that way. And part of the reason it doesn't work that way has been historically that coaches don't get nearly as much time as I think many fans assume they do to work with their teams during the off season. They get more now than they used to, but it's still not a ton. So it's easier than you might think to lose that continuity. And I do wonder if that's what happened at Purdue. And again, that this team was so good offensively, so talented, that maybe as a group, they just kind of fell in love with that. And you didn't have the same commitment to defense. I mean, when I think of Matt Painter teams, one of the first things that comes to mind, they've had good offensive teams before, but one of the first things that comes to mind is I think of teams that are physically tough, that kind of fight you, you know, some of the same characteristics that Michigan State has, you know, and it just didn't seem that way last year. They were soft by Purdue standards, not on the glass, but as a defensive group, they didn't make it as much of a fight as they usually do in the half court, you know?
Well, and so that's also the thing, you know, you wondered, was there a coach who departed who was maybe their scout for defensively that would change Painter's, you know, previous year?
They did lose Micah Shrewsbury, who I believe I've got that right. I think he came from Purdue. I believe that's where he was rather than with Brad Stevens. I just can't remember for sure as we're talking the timeline with him, but I think he was in a stint at Purdue. So there was that might have explained some of it, but man, Matt Painter's been doing this a long time. I mean, he's been the head coach there, like 15 years or so. So there's continuity.
He's got to be the second longest tenured coach.
Yeah, they know what they're doing in that program. So to me, that doesn't explain it. Absent a repeat this year, I'm just going to chalk it up to being one of those things in a very ill-timed development, considering that they had offensively, probably the best Purdue team since Glenn Robinson was there on the offensive end. And that team would have only been better because they had a superstar like Glenn Robinson. Last year's Purdue team was probably deeper in terms of just the number of really gifted offensive players they had. But I mean, that's the disappointment is if you're a Purdue fan, boy, you had the team that you look at on paper and say, this is a group that can win the whole thing, you know, and to get bounced in the Sweet 16, not win any Big Ten championships, that's hard. That's got to be a really hard position to be in, because if you're a Purdue fan, you also know, well, you're not presented with that opportunity every single year. You know, this isn't Duke. This isn't Kentucky. It's not even Michigan State. You know, you get these opportunities once, and obviously they're normally very good. I don't mean to suggest they're not, but last year they looked like a team that could be more than very good. That doesn't come around every year. And on top of everything else, more than very good and really, really experienced too. So it's like you're checking. They had an NBA talent, at least one, in Jaden Ivey, right? They had depth. They had incredible size. They had experience all over the roster. They could shoot. They had everything you want, and they still didn't get it done. That would be hard to grapple with if you were a Purdue fan, I would think. And you got beat by St. Peter's too. Let's not forget that.
Right. Yeah. The little engine that could. Yeah, the season felt a little bit like the Denzel season, senior year, where you thought this team was going to do a lot, and they, you know, get bounced way earlier than you expect.
The Denzel team at least won a Big Ten tournament.
They
did one thing, you know, that this Purdue team didn't do anything.
That's what, right? As it always says, you just got to hang a banner, right? Hang a banner. Do we hang any banners? They are true trophies. Yeah. Well, let's talk about the nexus of that team. Jaden Ivey, he was drafted number 5, who was mentioned last show, drafted right after Keegan Murray. He had a good freshman year, but sophomore season exploded. He averaged 17.3 points a game, 4.9 rebounds per game, shot 46, 36, and 74. Finished third in the team in assists with 110, which is a little over 3 a game. And then, as you mentioned, hit a little bit of issues with defense, but I mean, a fantastic year, Player of the Year candidate too, and Big Ten Player of the Year candidate as well.
I mentioned this on our Iowa episode. The decision at the 4 and 5 spot in the draft, Sacramento was picking 4th, Detroit 5th. As a Pistons fan, my concern was that Sacramento would take Ivey and leave the Pistons really with not much choice but to take Keegan Murray. Not that Keegan Murray isn't or won't be a good player, but I felt 2 things. 1, for Detroit's positional needs, and 2, the chance of one of those 2 guys emerging into a true superstar at the NBA level rather than just being a good player. I felt Jaden Ivey was that guy. Now, Keegan Murray may end up the better player, but to me, Jaden Ivey is a guy, if you saw him play last year, you saw a very similar style to guys like Ja Morant, Russell Westbrook at his best, John Wall at his best. These super athletic guards, some of them with size and height and frame strength like Jaden Ivey has. I mean, Russell Westbrook, I think, is a pretty good comparison in that way. Jaden Ivey last year was just every time I saw him, it was like the court was slanted downhill for him. And he truly gave Purdue an element they've never had, not only under Painter, under Gene Cady, they never ran like that. Jaden Ivey was a one-man transition game for Purdue, and it really made them that much more effective offensively because they got easy baskets they just typically don't get.
Sure. Gives you more open looks on 3 and all those things in transition, right? That you don't, when you have somebody who's that much of a threat to score at the rim.
He's got a lot of room to get better. I mean, he could get better as a shooter. He could get better as a decision maker, cut down on the turnovers. He could get a lot better defensively. But I think in terms of raw upside, and married to pretty good production too, he was the guy. And at that, at that range, once you got past the first 3 guys in the draft, to me, he was 4th. And the fact that he was there at 5, I was very happy about. No disrespect to Keegan Murray, but I just felt that way about Jaden Ivey, that Jaden Ivey has a chance that 5 years from now, we could be talking about him as an all-NBA player. I think there's that potential in him. Whereas I'm going to be kind of surprised if we're talking about Keegan Murray that way 5 years from now.
Right. You definitely think that his ceiling is higher than Murray.
Yeah, absolutely. Just because of the athleticism.
Yeah. Right. He can do more things. Yeah.
And he'll have the ball in his hands more. They'll play through him more than Keegan Murray, who's probably going to be a 4-man. Jaden Ivey is going to be, I think the way they're going to use him is interchangeably with Cade Cunningham in terms of putting the ball in his hands. So he's going to be in attack mode and have the opportunity to create things for himself much more readily. But in any event, getting back to what he meant for his team last year, this is a huge loss for Purdue because they have no other Jaden Ivey. They haven't had a Jaden Ivey. Michigan State, to use another, big time Big Ten program, has had guys over the years, maybe not quite the same package as Jaden Ivey, but Michigan State, as we know, has had a lot of guys who were very athletic, could make those, I call them those 99th percentile plays where they do something on a play or 2 on the court that you look at and just think there's nobody else out there who's capable of making that play. And oftentimes that is a separator between good teams and great teams, as if you've got a guy who could do that. And Jaden Ivey was that kind of guy. And yeah, they're not going to replace him anytime soon. So it's a very big loss. Obviously.
Yeah. Next is Travion Williams, 6'9", big guy from Detroit. He was strangely ended up in a reserve role, starting only 4 games, and played remarkably well considering that didn't seem to pout or have problems with that. Coming off the bench, averaging 12 points a game, 7.4 rebounds a game, shot 55, 36, and 60 in 20 minutes a game. led the team in assists with 112, and is a very creative passer. He single-handedly, I feel like he won that game and turned their season around. And turned his career around actually at Purdue a couple years ago in Breslin. And,
Absolutely.
And he's a guy
that was his debut.
Yeah,
really.
That's his debut. And he's a guy, wasn't he it was the question between Marcus Bingham and Travion Williams. Is that correct?
Yep.
And I guess you'd say, well, Michigan State picked wrong if it was their decision to make.
Yeah, and that's no disrespect to Marcus Bingham, but you have to go back in time and see where those guys were coming out of their junior seasons. So Travion Williams missed a lot of his junior season due to a foot injury, and he was already overweight, but he put on a lot more bad weight while he was in convalescence. I saw him in that spring afterwards, so the spring after his junior year, and Marcus Bingham was at that point kind of coming out of nowhere. He had grown some and he had really started to develop rapidly. And if you watched him, you also saw him showing some perimeter game, which with his length, was really exciting. Mm-hmm. Conversely, Travion Williams was really out of shape. And I think there was starting to maybe be some question, well, is this kid motivated sufficiently to get himself in better physical condition? Even with all that weight, he was still the top offensive rebounder in EYBL that spring. So you saw the hands and the ability to just, out compete guys on the glass at times. But boy, he was just, and he'd always had a really advanced sense of vision, ability to make passes, and he's also he might be the best ball handling true big that I've ever seen. He has a guard's handle. I mean, he really does. So he had a lot going for him. I was a fan, but I understood why. There was a certain point in time that people expected him to go to Michigan State. He had gone to high school in the Detroit area, originally from Chicago, but he had gone to high school in Detroit. And there was a point in time that Michigan State was expected to be the place he landed. And then it shifted around that time. And my understanding is Michigan State kind of started to emphasize Marcus Bingham more. Travion Williams goes to Purdue, and it was the right move for him. I mean, if you are a big man who's got game and you are out of shape, the only other place that I would say, certainly in that part of the country, maybe anywhere in the country, that I would say other than Michigan State that you should go to is Purdue, because they emphasize big man play. They utilize their bigs. They're not out there just setting screens and as window dressing. They get big men the ball. They play through them. And they also know what it takes to get a big kid into shape. They did it with Caleb Swanigan. They did it with AJ Hammonds. They've done it with a lot of guys, just like Michigan State has over the years. So he made a very smart decision for himself, and I think he had a great career at Purdue. Offensively and as a rebounder, I don't think there were many flaws. I mean, this is a guy who was really, really good as a post player, made plays for others with his vision. And he actually developed a little bit of a face-up game offensively late in his career. You mentioned that whatever it was, 36% from three was not on high volume, but that was progress.
Yeah.
However, there was one glaring issue that I think is probably going to keep him from having a long or serious NBA career, or maybe one at all. And it was a problem for Purdue last year, and that's defensively. He just, even though he got in a much, much, much better shape, he is limited in terms of his ability to move his feet, to move laterally, his foot quickness, all of that. And it shows up in the modern game way too much. So for as much as he gives you on the offensive end, it was a problem at times defensively. If Michigan State fans go back to the final play of the game, Michigan State against Purdue at Breslin, what does Michigan State do? They put Tyson Walker in a pick and roll with, I think it was Marcus Bingham, but it was whatever big was out there that Williams was guarding. And they managed to get Williams in a switch. So now Travion Williams is guarding Tyson Walker. It was game over. The only thing that was going to bail Purdue out is if Tyson just missed the shot.
Right, yeah.
Because you knew he was going to get a clean look. And he did. He used his handle and the threat of his quickness to be able to create space where he had a wide open three, and he nailed it. Ball game. Travion Williams tried, but he just did not have the physical capability to do more than he did on that play. And I think that moment was kind of emblematic of where the problems were for him. I do want something you mentioned, though, before we turn to the next guy that I do want to give him credit for, though. As you said, he had been a starter, I think even part of his freshman season and pretty much all of his sophomore and junior year. But Zach Edey was coming on so strongly that they decided that was a better look to start him. Travion Williams' minutes didn't change much. He still played a little bit more than Edey. He averaged just over 20 minutes a game. But I think the change in the role, a lot of guys who had the career that Travion Williams had had to that point would have been upset by that move, just symbolically. He and I actually mentioned it last season as one of my few concerns about that team was, look, if this happens, how is Travion Williams going to handle it? What's that going to do to the team? It was never a problem from what I could tell. He seemed like the consummate teammate. He was engaged on the bench, never pouted, came in and played hard and played well when he was asked to off the bench. So give credit to him for really showing a level of maturity, because a lot of guys wouldn't have handled it that well.
And certainly loyalty, too, for a team that took a chance on you in some ways and helped recreate your body and bring you along. And with the transfer portal, right? I mean, the cost to leaving the team is a lot different than it was a few years ago.
Right.
So let's talk about the next player departure is Sasha Stefanovic, 6'5" wing, really good shooter, veteran presence. He averaged 10.4 points a game on 39, 38, 87 shooting. He decided to turn pro, and he's playing in Greece. And he was a guy who definitely could really hurt you some games. But I felt, especially near the end of the season, he kind of just disappeared at times, and which is strange for a guy who was as good as he was shooting. But he was a guy who didn't need much separation on those pick and rolls, and so all right off a screen. I mean, he'd just bury it in a hurry.
Very quick release, and thus a very tough cover. If I recall correctly, I didn't go back before this to check the stats, but my recollection is that Michigan State did a pretty good job on him at the win at Breslin.
I don't remember hurting us too much.
Right. And I think Michigan State did a pretty good job getting around those screens, because that was the challenge with Stefanovic, is he knew how to use screens effectively. And Purdue runs that motion game where everybody's constantly setting picks or moving. And boy, he knew that, in year 4, he knew that thing cold and had such a quick release that, it was a real challenge to get to him. But you're right. There was some inconsistency late in the season. I also think, I know my expectation was, okay, this is the next guy and Purdue's had a line of guys like this. The most recent one before him was Dakota Mathias, where, he's 6'4", 6'5", good shooter, not a superstar, but a really good college player and somebody who's solid defensively. That never really came along for Stefanovic. He never became the kind of defender that somebody like Mathias was. And I think that was, again, Purdue you looked up and down that lineup and you just didn't see a lot of plus defenders. But he was a really good shooter, that's for sure.
So next we'll go to Eric Hunter Jr. He's 6'3" guard, started 19 games, averaged 26 minutes. Scored 6.2 points a game, shot 48, 46, and 69, which is quite an improvement previously with his deep shot. He decided to take his COVID year and left for Butler to go hang out with Thad Matta.
Yeah, and that was really a surprise to me. I mean, he is an Indianapolis kid, so he's going home, but I mean, West Lafayette, Indiana, or Indianapolis, come on. I didn't dig too deeply into this, but that had to be a negative. And Matt Painter, for a guy who's been as successful as he is, and, really seems to, I don't see any outward signs of why there would be issues. he has lost some guys in the past. You remember a couple of years ago, Matt Harms, who was
Right.
playing big minutes, left for BYU. And again, a big man, boy, you can't ask for more than what Purdue presents to you because you actually get used, whereas some places you don't. That one didn't make sense on the surface. I had trouble with that. And this one too. And the next one we'll talk about. I'm not quite sure what was going on, but again, it's a loss to Purdue because Eric Hunter was a guy with real experience who was a proven shooter, had good size and athletic ability, and just, knew how to play in their system, played a lot of minutes. I think you said it, 26 minutes a game last year. And, it'd be one thing if it was like Stefanovic and he said, okay, I just want to move on. I'm done with college. Okay, you would have liked to have had him for the COVID year, but, he wants to move on. You can swallow that. To transfer to another school and not a higher profile school, I mean, no disrespect to Butler, but, come on. It just, the only thing I could think of is that maybe he felt like there was a chance to be featured at Butler and just get more shots and play a bigger role in the offense that he would at Purdue. Maybe it's as simple as that, but I don't know.
Yeah, and there are always other things too that you don't know. I mean, maybe there's other reasons to go back home to Indianapolis. Maybe the graduate program in Butler is what he wants, or something like that, right? We don't know those sorts of things.
I don't believe that one.
They are student athletes after all, right?
No, I'm just saying I don't believe that there are opportunities at Butler that aren't present at Purdue.
That's probably true.
At the grad level.
Yeah. Next, finally, for players leaving is Isaiah Thompson. He was a 6-foot player, averaged 4.2 points a game, started 20 games, played 16 minutes a game. He shot 44, 42, and 79. Again, just a reflection of that lethal outside shooting they had. He left through the portal and ended up at the Florida Gulf Coast.
It's a little easier for me to understand this one, but only because he played a lesser role than Hunter. He played fewer minutes, even though he started a lot. But again, Florida Gulf Coast, the only thing I can figure is they've told him, hey, we're going to get you a ton of shots. But it was surprising to me. And again, a blow. You're talking about 3 guards who all could have opted to come back, and none of them did. So this is why we're talking about Purdue at number 6 rather than number 1 or number 2 or number 3.
Right.
It's because that's a hole. That's not to say they don't have guys who are maybe capable of filling it, but you start the year with a question because they could have had all this experience and proven production back, and they don't have any of it. And they lost Ivey, of course, too, from that group after a sophomore year. So their top 4 guards all gone.
Yeah, it's interesting. You almost wonder sometimes these players thought, well, this is going to be our year, and then it just didn't work out. Like, okay, I guess we'll just break the band apart and we'll go our own ways. I don't know.
And maybe it's that, but at least in Thompson's case, I could see the rationale in terms of role potentially. You would think you get a lot more shots at Florida Gulf Coast, and maybe it's just that simple.
Right. So let's talk about the players returning. The first one you can't miss is Zach Edey. He's 7'4", Canadian big man. He had a coming out party last year. He definitely played a lot. He started it and displaced Travion Williams. He averaged 14.4 points a game, a team high 7.7 rebounds per game, and shot 65% from the floor and 65% from the line. And so he was much like Isaac Haas, but maybe not quite as strong as Isaac Haas, but I think he's a little taller and bigger. If he gets close, it was just, I don't even know if he had to even jump to dunk the ball.
He's a better offensive player, certainly at an earlier stage than Isaac Haas was. Edey is, and some of what I'm going to say is perhaps going to sound overly critical. So I want to get the positives out of the way first. If Zach Edey catches the ball in the blocks, it's over.
Yeah.
It's just over. You can't, there is no player. I don't care if you're Hunter Dickinson, all 7'1", 260 of him, whatever he is, looks small next to Zach Edey. There is nobody in this conference and in the country who can physically stop Zach Edey if he catches the ball cleanly, 5 to 8 feet from the basket. He is going to score because he's got, as you said, 64, 65% from the floor. He knows how to finish shots. He will also get some garbage points, just again because of his size. So those are really, really good elements that cannot be overstated, in my opinion. That makes him a huge weapon, figuratively and literally, in the Purdue lineup. That said, there are some issues, in my opinion, with him. First and foremost, defensively. For a guy his size, he really doesn't provide the kind of rim protection you might expect. He averaged not even a block and a half a game. So it's not nothing, but 7'4", you would expect, hey, this is a guy who, takes away 2.5, 3 shots a game, right?
Right. Yeah. Absolutely.
They have not gotten that from him. And I think part of the reason it shows up in other areas of the game as well. He just does not have much mobility. It's, offensively, it's not such a big deal because, Purdue's running game consisted of one guy last year. Now that he's gone, they'll go back to not doing much in transition, most likely. So the fact that he doesn't get up and down the floor, great, is not the end of the world for them. But man, it shows up defensively. I think it shows up at the rim. He's not the kind of weak side rim protector you might think he'd be because he can't get over there quickly enough. He really struggles away from the basket. You get him out on the floor, it's tough for him. So he hurts them there. The free throw shooting is not an abject disaster, but with the amount that he gets fouled, the opportunities he gets, I think you'd like to see a tick better than 65%, And then the last thing is rebounding. His numbers are not bad, but he's just not capable of range rebounding.
Right.
So if it's in his area, great. He's going to get it because he's just bigger than everybody else. But if it's out of his area a little bit, he's not going to be able to go get you something. So for as good as he is in the areas that are strengths, there are limitations. And I guess the final thing, too, to talk about as a limitation is his endurance. I don't know if he's capable of playing more, but Matt Painter hasn't pushed it. He averaged like 18 and a half minutes a game last year, and that's about what he played as a freshman. Now, I will say part of that is probably down to the fact that he had a guy like Trevion Williams. And so maybe the fact that he doesn't have that means he leans on Edey a little bit more this year. But that's, again, something else. I need to see it before I buy in.
Right. And in some ways you look at that and say, that he's putting Trevion Williams in there in winning time and that times when he has to have some veteran presence and people who are making good decisions and can, know what they're doing. And is Edey going to be the guy who can do that? Are you going to trust him at the end of the game? Or are you going to have to go really small because you're not going to have a presence like Williams in there to back him up?
Yeah, they're going to be different. And as we get through this discussion, it's at least an arguable point that this, if you look at the totality of the team, meaning the defensive end too, they might be better off with what they're going to throw out there this year. It remains to be seen, but I could see an argument for it. But, I'm going to be interested to see how many minutes Edey plays. So he's a totally unique weapon. Nobody else in major college basketball has anyone like him. And there's certain things he does that you simply do not have an answer for. But it comes with some weaknesses too.
Yeah. Spoiler alert. They do not have another 7'4" player on their team to replace Edey, although someone close.
They do have a 7'2" guy.
Yeah, we'll talk about him in a little bit. So next returning player is Mason Gillis. 6'8".
Can I
go ahead.
I stop you there for just a second? Yeah. There's an interesting stat I read. This is phenomenal to me. Purdue is working on a streak of 14 years in a row where they have at least one 7-foot player on the roster, and 12 years in a row where they have at least one who's 7'2" or taller. That is remarkable. Remarkable in an era where you do not see that kind of size at the major college level as much as you used to. I think in general, we could say things, not so much of the Big Ten, but most of the country, things have gotten maybe a little smaller than they used to at the 5 as the game has evolved, but man, not at Purdue.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, you have to figure if you're 7 feet tall and you want to be featured at a team at a major school, at least Power Five, there's no better place. There's nowhere else you go than Purdue because
Go to Purdue.
yeah, you know, if you're not very good, you might go to Florida Gulf Coast or a place like that.
Here's an interesting recruiting thing. There was a point in time that I think there was a maybe not a consensus, but there was a school of thought that Purdue was where Hunter Dickinson was going to land. And that was before Juwan Howard got the job. But there was, so they were in line for a guy who's only 7'1". But I mean, you're right. If you are that kind of player, you have to look at Purdue. You'd be insane not to. It just seems to me that at least in terms of quality guys, we're seeing fewer of them than we used to.
Yeah, I wonder where they're going. I mean, because I assume people are just as tall as they were, if not taller than they used to be.
It doesn't stand to reason in that sense. But if you look across college basketball, it doesn't feel like we have. Maybe a better way of putting it is we probably do have as many 7-footers. We don't have as many 7-footers playing major roles.
Sure. Yeah.
As they used to. I think that's probably it. The days when, you would have Patrick Ewing and Hakeem Olajuwon in the game, in the college game at the same time, mega stars, mega big men like that. We don't have that anymore.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see how many. There may be just as many players, but now they're playing for UC Riverside or something like that.
That too. Yep.
All right, so let's go to the next player, Mason Gillis, a 6'8" junior power forward. He definitely came along this season, and he started 25 games, averaged 6.4 points a game and 4.8 rebounds a game in about 24 minutes. He shot 50, 41, and 85 on the season, and was a guy who you expect to have a much bigger role this year and really played well last season.
He's a good player. I really liked him. He'd had some injury problems in his Purdue career, including early last season. But once he got healthy, he just forced his way into bigger minutes, and he's really a guy who's capable of doing a lot of things. I think he's one guy who, if his voice can get bigger in that team, might be able to help turn things back around defensively, because he's a pretty good defensive player, a pretty versatile defensive player from what I've seen. He's obviously, you look at the 3-point shooting, he's capable of stretching the floor. He's pretty well put together, so I think he can do more than he did around the rim. I don't know how much more they're going to look to him offensively, although it might be some. But I just really like him as kind of a jackknife guy who can help you in a lot of different ways. So good player.
And certainly just observationally, just watch him. He certainly seems like a guy who is vocal. And so, to your point about being more of a leader, maybe he's that guy. Maybe he's the guy who kind of helps direct the defense a little bit too and gets them straightened out.
They need people to step forward this year in that capacity because, as I said, they lost their best player in Jaden Ivey, and then they lost 4 other guys who had played a ton of basketball for them in the 3 other guards and then Trevion Williams. So those, although none of those guys seemed like, that they weren't going to make you forget Mateen Cleaves as leaders, but they had to have had dominant voices just due to their experience. So now there's a void there. Some other guys have got to step forward, and Mason Gillis might be one of those guys.
Next returning player we'll talk about is Caleb First. He's a 6'10" sophomore. He started 12 times while Gillis was recovering from injury. He had a really nice season. He averaged 4.1 points a game, 3.2 rebounds a game in only 15 minutes. He shot really well, 57, 42, and 72. And so he has the ability to move, unlike Edey. So he might be either a solution for Edey or backup, or maybe playing the 4 spot.
He had surgery this offseason because apparently going back to his high school career, so this is a multi-year issue, he would have pain in his heel. And he just kind of got used to it. But they finally decided to do something about it this offseason. And so he had surgery to deal with a bone spur. And the thinking is, of course, that's going to make him better off in the long run. And I would guess that's the case. But the downside is he hasn't been able to practice this offseason until fairly, I think he's practicing now, but until fairly recently. So you don't know what effect that's going to have. if we assume that he's able to get back at something close to 100% conditioning and get his game back and all of that by the time the season starts, then you're talking about a very valuable player. This is a kid Michigan State recruited heavily and wanted badly. And, Matt Painter historically loses more than he wins against Tom Izzo. Tom Izzo's beaten him for a lot of guys, but most recently Xavier Booker, by the way. But Painter won for Caleb First. And I'll tell you, I was really impressed last season with what I saw from him. I did not expect him to shoot the way he did. He had a reputation as a decent shooter, but I didn't expect plus 40% right away. And I think over time, he's never going to be, he's not Trevion Williams as a back to the basket guy, but he's got that capability. I mean, I think he'll be a good inside player for them. And as you mentioned, he's got more mobility than they typically have had at that position. So at the 5, that is. So if he plays some 5, which I think could happen as a tag team partner for Edey, I could see that actually benefiting Purdue in a net sense, because I think he's got the potential to actually be he reminds me in terms of his size and his athletic ability. He reminds me a little bit of somebody like Matt Costello. And if you remember, Matt Costello, by the time he was a senior, became a very good defensive player, particularly as a pick and roll guy. And I see a similar combination of size and mobility in a healthy version, at least, of First. So I think he's got a lot more to give, and I think he could be pretty good this year, although likely in a reserve role, almost certainly in a reserve role.
Next one we'll talk about is Brandon Newman. He's a 6'6 junior, averaging 4.6 points a game on 32, 32, and 79 shooting. He played 13 minutes a game. And as a freshman, he shot much better at 40, 38, and 94. So definitely a drop down from the previous season, where I guess he was a little hurt this season.
Well, his problem was the games he just did not play coach's decision. And he fell way down the pecking order. By the end of the year, he just wasn't playing very much. In fact, I figured he would be a likely transfer candidate. Maybe he was dissuaded from that by seeing the guys ahead of him in the rotation deciding to leave.
Yeah.
If you want one possible answer, and it's nowhere near the totality of it, but one possible answer in a small way, at least, for why Purdue went backward defensively is Brandon Newman's got pretty good defensive ability, and his playing time just cratered as last year went along. Whereas his freshman year, which was actually his redshirt freshman year, he played a lot and played increasingly as the year went along. So I think the hope is now that there's a clear open path to him maybe even becoming a starter again, he could help improve Purdue's defense because he's athletic. He's got good size at 6'6", kind of a long player, and he understands what he's doing defensively. But a key is going to obviously be, can he rediscover his offensive game?
And finally, for a returning player, we'll talk about Ethan Morton. He's a salty 6'7 junior, saw his role increase at Newman's expense. He averaged 15 minutes a game, scoring just 2.4 points a game, shooting 48, 44, and 68. And he had 50 assists to just 17 turnovers.
Yeah, he's, the shooting percentage came by leaps and bounds over his freshman year. He came out of high school with a reputation as a mediocre shooter, and he was even worse than that in limited minutes as a freshman. But last year, I think the combination of improved shooting and just his ability to not make mistakes and still make plays for others, he's got good vision and great size at 6'7". That got, and that Newman wasn't playing well, got him more and more minutes. And I think he's another guy that's set to maybe even step into a starting role. Purdue, because they run motion, they don't have the same need that many other schools, Michigan State would be included in this, has for a true point guard. If you look at Purdue over the course of Painter's career there, they really haven't often had a guy that you look at and say, well, that's their point guard. I mentioned Dakota Mathias a few minutes ago. He led them in assists a couple of times, and he was really a wing. If you remember, Carson Edwards was a point guard sized guy, but he was really a scorer.
Yeah.
Other guys were like Mathias were the playmakers. Ethan Morton fits that role. He's not a guy that you look at and say, well, that's a point guard, but he probably is their best passer. So he does a lot of things that Painter likes. I think especially if he can keep that shooting up or somewhere close to the level that he was at last year, but with more volume, he stands to see his role increase pretty significantly.
Well, let's talk about the newcomers to the team. The Boilermakers welcome in Trey Kaufman-Renn. He's a 6'9", 225-pound redshirt freshman. Highly regarded recruit, top 50 consensus coming out of high school, but decided redshirt, and just for obvious reasons because there just wasn't much as far as minutes to be played. So now I think we're going to play the 4, the 5, maybe even down to the 3.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. I've seen speculation in some quarters that he and First are kind of going to be interchangeable between the 4 and the 5 because he's a strong kid at 6'9". So he could probably handle some 5 minutes, especially against certain lineups. I've then seen other people say that because of his handle and his athleticism, he could even handle some 3, and they may have a need for that. The one caveat to that is he was in high school, for as highly ranked as he was not really a proven jump shooter. That's an area that they say he needs to improve, but lots of talent. I mean, you do not see this typically. A top 50 guy redshirts,
Yeah.
But he did, and it was not injury related. He practiced all year. They are expecting him to be an immediate factor, and I would expect that as well. Tough to see him breaking into the starting lineup unless somehow they do decide to play him at the 3, but I don't expect that. I think he and First give them a tag team at the 4 and the 5 in reserve. So you look at Purdue's 4-man group with Gillis and Edey starting and those 2 younger guys as backups. Boy, that's pretty good.
Yeah, not bad.
That's once again, they're really strong inside.
And then we'll talk about Brian Waddell, a 6'8" redshirt freshman. So he's a late add-on to last season's recruiting class.
Yeah, he's an interesting guy. Very late addition. His high school won a state championship in Indiana. He's a legacy recruit. Some people may remember his dad, Matt Waddell, was a point guard on the Glenn Robinson teams at Purdue. So his dad played at a high level there, did a lot of winning. Brian Waddell has good size at 6'8". He reportedly can shoot very well, but he's had these injury issues. And so it's unclear how physically ready he'll be by season's beginning. Whether he can find his way into a role or not, I think depends on what Purdue's shooting needs are and how well his shot translates in his first year playing. But it's a possibility that he could crack through with a role in the rotation. I'm just not ready to bet on it yet.
Sure. And then David Jenkins, Jr., he's 6'1", transfer from Utah. He averaged 8.5 points a game on 39, 40, and 82 shooting.
Yeah, this is a guy who, give him credit, he has used the relaxed transfer rules to go up the ladder. You may have it in front of you. I think I put it in the notes. Where did he start?
He started at South Dakota State, then UNLV, then Utah.
Then UNLV, then Utah, now Purdue. So 4 schools, each one a progression up the college basketball ladder. There are certain kind of stereotype Purdue guys. One is the giant center. The other is the guy who is point guard sized but has no point guard game. There was PJ Thompson.
Yes.
Then there was Carson Edwards. Then there was Isaiah Thompson. Now there is David Jenkins. He is 6'1", but is no kind of point guard. He averaged less than an assist a game for Utah last year. So don't expect him to come in and be the playmaker. I think what he is largely is a replacement for what they got out of somebody like Isaiah Thompson. He's an undersized guy who has a proven ability to shoot, and that's kind of what he does, and that's what they'll look to him to do at Purdue. Give them a little bit of perimeter scoring punch. How big a role he plays, I think, is yet to be determined, but there's a chance it could be significant, maybe even starting. I don't know.
Yeah, you expect that he would make that transfer out of Utah, which is, they're playing with the Pac-12, that unless he thought he was going to have a bigger role, that, or at least an opportunity.
Yeah, and he didn't start regularly for Utah. And again, no disrespect to Utah. They're historically a solid program, but Purdue is a step up the ladder.
Without a doubt.
And there's an opportunity too.
Absolutely. Right. Fletcher Lawyer will be the next one. He's 6'4", out of Fort Wayne, Indiana, but obviously the last name, he's the younger brother of MSU guard Foster Lawyer, who just finished his career, I think, at Davidson, right? Or did he announce that he's staying? I feel like he wasn't.
He's playing the COVID year.
So he's going to play the COVID year.
Yeah, he's coming back.
So anyway, so he's obviously much bigger than his brother. But aside from that, and I assume he's a good shooter as well.
Very, very good shooter. Yeah, it's going to be interesting to watch. Michigan State was never in this one. There just did not seem to be mutual interest, and that's before Foster transferred out. So it had nothing to do with that. He at 6'4", that's one obvious difference. And so even though Fletcher has some limitations, he's not a great athlete, probably not much more at this stage than a jump shooter offensively. But because he's 6'4", you can see more potential for him to hang in there defensively. It'll be easier for him to get his shot. And he is a dead-eye shooter. There's no doubt about that. So, again, because Purdue has these holes in the backcourt and they have a need for shooting in particular, you could see a path to early minutes for him. But we just have to see how it goes. I think he'll play a role. I just don't know how big it will be right away. We'll have to see. And I think it'll be dependent upon how all these young or new guys they've added in the backcourt, how everybody develops. And that's not crystal clear at this point.
Next is Indiana Mr. Basketball, a 6-foot point guard from Indiana, Braden Smith. So he's obviously, the hope is to take over the point guard roles in the future, but probably not next year, I would guess.
Well, again, injury problems, and that's a common theme. They've got a lot of guys who have been banged up, and it's part of why I say we have to. Where I just mentioned it with Fletcher Lawyer, we have to see how it sorts out, because health is going to be determinative of how big a role some of these guys can play. Braden Smith has sat out a good part of the summer, recovering and the spring too. Before that. After being Mr. Basketball in the state of Indiana. So they like him. He's a good shooter, tough, kind of a floor leader type, fits the mold of what you'd want, but how ready is he going to be right out of the jump? It's unclear.
Next is Camden Hade, I think is what it is. 6'7" forward. He missed some time also due to injury with his foot. So this is like Michigan State had the foot problems for a while, right? Now Purdue's got all the foot issues. But he's a top 100 recruit.
Like 4 guys. Yeah, he's originally from Minnesota. So yet another guy that gets away from the Gophers.
Yeah.
But they like him as a wing. 6'7". They think he could shoot. They also think when he's healthy, he's got more. The 2 previous guys I mentioned, Lawyer and Smith, are at this point really jump shooters. This kid isn't. They believe that he's got more versatility to his game offensively. He can shoot too, but they think he's got more of an off the dribble face-up game. So, again, if he's healthy, maybe there's a role there, but is he going to be healthy? You don't know. And
as we alluded to before, the 7'2" pipeline continues. Will Berg, 260 pounds from Sweden. And his expectation is to redshirt and to sort of just kind of figure things out and back up Edey, unless barring, disaster, I suppose, at the 5 this season.
You're right. An injury might change it, but the expectation is that he will redshirt. The thing they like about him that may separate Berg from some of the other guys they've had in recent years is they think he's actually already got a decent face-up game and range on his jumper. So they think he might in time be a legitimate floor stretching option. They haven't really had as much of that. If you look at Edey, he's not a three-point shooter. Isaac Haas was not a three-point shooter. AJ Hammond's not a three-point shooter. The only guy who had a little bit of that was Matt Harms, but his range really didn't get quite out to three. It was more mid-range. So by and large, these supersized centers they've had have been post guys, and that's pretty much it. This kid they think could be different. But again, most likely he's going to get time, unless he just comes in and just bowls people over. And I have not read any suggestions that that's happened, but it might not be made public. So I guess we'll see. But I'm not expecting that that he will make an immediate impact for them. But yeah, I mean, it certainly continues the Boilermaker tradition. Another 7-2 or 7-2 plus guy in the mix. Yeah, we'll see where it goes. But boy, you look at the track record, you have to assume there's a reasonably good chance that Will Burks can end up as a good player.
So then looking overall at the team, they obviously lost a ton from last season. There's a ton of questions and sort of who's going to take over the scoring roles, the volume and the shooting, and whether they'll improve defensively. It's really a crapshoot what this team's going to look like next year. They could be sneaky good, or they may be a lot worse than we anticipate. I guess it's right. I mean,
and that's going to, I think, again, there are two major issues with this team. One is, can they get back on track defensively? And I think that one I feel a little more confidence in. And I'm basing a lot of that on the guy who's coaching the program.
Yeah, past history.
I mean, Matt Painter has done it over and over and over again. So I've got to believe that they will find a way to be better at that end of the floor. So I think that one, now that doesn't mean they're great defensively. It just means they're better. We'll see how much better. The second bit, though, is a little dicier, and that's what happens with their guard play. Now, it would help a lot if Morton and Newman prove to be very much ready to step into major roles. Because if those guys can do that, then they're set. Then they've only got to find one new starter out of all these new guys. If Morton and Newman are not major solutions, it becomes tougher, because then you're counting on a transfer and all these freshmen, a couple of which have injury problems to deal with. So there are some serious question marks with this team. And we've talked about this. There are going to be serious question marks right to the top of this list. The team I pick at number one to win it is going to have many more questions than we typically see in a preseason favorite. So Purdue is no exception. I have them at 6, even acknowledging those issues, based primarily on two things. One is the coach, Matt Painter. I just think it's more likely than not that to an extent he figures this out. And picking them at 6 is not going off crazy deep, and I'm not picking them to win it, but I'm expecting them to be a tournament team and to be competitive and in the mix somewhere in the Big Ten. And I think that's putting some confidence in Matt Painter and what he typically does. And I don't think that's misplaced. The other thing is, for all the weaknesses in the perimeter group, let's acknowledge that post group could be really good. I mean, Edey's got some problems, but the things he does well, you don't have an answer for. I think Gillis could come on this year, and I think the two young reserves are both really good and potentially might actually be quote unquote better or more quote unquote talented, to use two words people throw around without always knowing what they mean. But I think it's possible that First and Kaufman are actually more talented than the guys starting ahead of them.
Yeah, well, that's a good
in
position to be in.
totality,
Yeah.
as total players.
Yeah.
Just could do more things, are better athletically, those types. That's what I mean. So that's a really good place to start when you can count on that and you've got 4 guys for those 2 spots. You feel pretty good about that if you're Matt Painter. The question is, can you get enough from the other spots?
And there always seems to be a surprise team every year that overperforms. Is this a team that you see can overperform and win the Big Ten or at least tie for the title? You don't see them falling as far as 10th or something like that. Certainly. So
no, that would take a lot to me for that to happen. I just think they've got enough that's not in the cards. But winning it, let's put it this way. To win it, Morton and Newman have to be really good. Not just, okay, these guys are serviceable and we're getting solid play from them. They have to be really good. And then they've still got to find somebody among all those newcomers that can step into a starting role. So, that bit isn't impossible. I think they'll get something out of that group. But for Morton and Newman to be as good as I think they'd have to be for Purdue to be a true title contender, I would put that as a low percentage probability. Non-zero, but, 25% maybe. That might even be high. I haven't seen either of those guys. They haven't been asked to. Newman kind of was as a freshman, but even then, he wasn't a star. I just haven't seen those guys put in a position where they've delivered or they've been asked to do that much. And yet at the same time, I don't, we're going to say about Michigan State, for example, a guy like Jaden Akins, I think we both think is poised for a big breakout, but there's reason to think that, just like there was reason last year at this time to think that Jaden Ivey was going to be way better than he was as a freshman. Mm-hmm. There were tangible reasons behind those projections. I don't see that in the cards for either of these 2 guys. And not to that degree. And I think that's what you'd have to have if you were going to label Purdue as a serious title contender. But could they finish, could they finish 3rd? Could they finish 4th? Yeah, they could finish higher than I've got them. I think that could happen. And they could also finish lower. There's so much volatility this year that, who the hell knows? But for now, this feels about right to me.
Yeah, that seems about right to me as well. They don't seem to have that guy lurking in the grass that's going to get you like a Keegan Murray or Johnny Davis.
we could end up surprised, but there's just not, like last year we talk about, there was a group of I guess it was 3 guys that made huge leaps from freshman year to sophomore year. You had Keegan Murray at Iowa, you had Johnny Davis at Wisconsin, and then you had Jaden Ivey at Purdue, right?
Yep.
All 3 of those guys you could see coming.
Yes.
Maybe not to the level that they got to. That was the case with Davis and Murray, less so with Ivey. Ivey pretty much was what I thought he'd be. But you knew they were going to be good. You could see the jump happening. I just don't see that guy on this Purdue team. And maybe I'll be wrong, but I don't see it.
Yeah, and the difference, of course, then be you'd have to significantly improve in defense or some other aspect of the game that you didn't have last year if you lack that superstar, right? Well, I think that'll wrap it up for our discussion of Purdue. If you enjoy the show and you want to support us, we appreciate your support. You can go to tffinots.com/support. There you can have opportunities to link to us on Patreon and become a monthly supporter of the show. We also accept one-time gifts via PayPal or Venmo. Also, I'd encourage you to continue to share the show with your friends or other Spartan fans and keep giving us reviews on whatever the podcast player is that you use. The 5 stars and written reviews are always best. And until next time, the Final Four is not on the schedule. Go Green.